Hey everybody, today I am going to be reviewing The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. This film came out in 1966 and it was directed by Sergio Leone. Leone is of course most associated with the spaghetti western of the mid-1960s because of how he was able to elevate the genre. What was once widely considered to be sort of just like a cheap knockoff of American westerns, he was able to kind of turn into this real kind of absurdist artistic experiment that isn't a knockoff of American Western so much as it is kind of a subversion of our expectations when it comes to a lot of the American Western stereotypes and cliches. I think Leone is not only approaching that from an intelligent perspective, but also from an outsider's perspective, from an Italian perspective, which he is utilizing to his advantage. I think he really does have a lot of affection. It's quite clear that he has affection for American Westerns in part, especially like the great John Ford epics and such, but he is finding the areas of those films that perhaps could be explored in a more unique way and capitalizing on that. It's almost as if he was just thrown a little cheap tin can of American throwaway cliches, American Western cliches, and they're all just kind of bouncing around in there. And then his goal here is to make gold out of all of that by molding them into a sort of clever pastiche. And it develops something all its own to me. And so ironically, even though it's supposed to be sort of making fun of American Westerns and it's cheaper than a lot of those American Westerns, to me, in a lot of ways, it's more elevated and more sophisticated than a lot of those Westerns, especially for the time, the 60s. A movie like The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly does it best in terms of the spaghetti Western. It's exploring the darker aspects of the Western genre, the darker aspects of morality, and it's less about glorification of like masculinity and war, less romanticism also of like the Lone Ranger cowboy, John Wayne type figure. And it does this in a way that is very cheeky, of course, as I said, done, of course, in a pop culture conscious sort of way, but it also has kind of a surrealist tone to it, an edge, like a tinge of almost like the psychedelic revolution. But just a whiff, really, but it's certainly there. The movies kind of do mess with your mind, and they are quite quirky in a lot of ways, off kilter. But getting to the heart of it, it's all represented in these three main characters that they're representing all kinds of different aspects of morality in my eyes. You have the good, played by the very gruff, very stoic Clint Eastwood, and then you've got the bad, played by the very menacing-looking Lee Van Cleef, and of course the ugly, played by Eli Wallach, very famously by Eli Wallach, in what I believe is maybe one of his best performances. Just the title, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, is meant to set up the shades of that morality, and that even when you've got good and bad, there's always going to be an in-between. But even in that title, it's still simplified. But again, everything just has a tinge of the cheekiness and certainly a sense of self-awareness, making fun of the more cut and dry elements of a lot of American films, which tend to be more patriotic, simplifying the antagonist and the protagonist motivation so that everything is more clearly defined. But here, that's not really the case. All of the characters in here have something to gain for themselves and their reasons for why they're doing what they're doing. They are often out for themselves, they are survivors, and they're often faced with questions of morality and its complexities. Which is why the title, again, is so funny and why it kind of encompasses the whole attitude of the spaghetti Western in my eyes. Because often when you are fighting for a side, particularly like in war or something like that, it's so easy to see the other side as evil, but yet, you know, they come from a certain environment and they're built in that environment. And so a lot of decisions come from a mix of virtue and darkness, a mix of selflessness as well as selfishness. I think you see a lot of that arc, particularly in the Eastwood character, because he is supposed to represent the good here, but I mean, it's quite clear from the beginning, he's not totally good at all. He's not necessarily the hero of the film. Yeah, he fends for himself and he takes what he can. But later he begins to see a different side to things and he starts to change his perspective, and that's where we're really seeing the redemptive arc. And Tuco here, who's the most famous character and the one played by Eli Wallach, is also a character that in a lot of ways is similar in that he is a survivor fending for himself, but he really only cares about getting rich and flipping off basically everybody else in a really crass sort of way. He's a crass character, but also a wonderful character. It's a very physical performance, a very obnoxious performance. He's playing a character who's meant to be quite annoying and quite in your face, in contrast to the Clint Eastwood character. He's an annoying character, but he's not some sort of slapstick side character or anything like that. I think that he is a very important character, and a lot of the silliness and the annoying parts of him are all tools he's using as manipulation to get what he wants, and it all comes through in the mannerisms. So I think he's definitely smarter than he appears. But you only see that when the characters start to shift their different dynamics, and I love that the film is very, very light on plot. Not much of a plot at all going on here, but it's more about the internal character dilemmas. And the rest of everything that we love about the film, to me, is just created in the incredible, captivating direction. For my money, this is some of the best directing and some of the best tension building of Italian cinema. It's not just cool set pieces and tension building for the sake of tension building. No, there are long stretches in this movie where there's not a lot happening, where there's a lot of silence, where you have two characters in a scene and the power dynamic is shifting ever so slowly between one character to the next. Here, it's constantly surprising you. Again, the morals are constantly shifting. Characters are gaining constantly, but also being enlightened and changing their courses. But the power of so many of these sequences, that haunting feeling of isolation in this really flat landscape, mixed with that intimate tension where it feels like just a door is creaking really, 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 really slowly, is so palpable. The opening scene where Angel Eyes is interrogating the man in his home is an extraordinary piece of suspense building. So captivating every single moment. Completely ripped off in the Inglourious Basterds opening by Quentin Tarantino. Done well, I think, to an extent, but this one to me has much more of a soul to it and a sophistication because of its lack of dialogue, and the understanding of the less is more philosophy, even in the midst of pastiche filmmaking. There are moments in that scene where the two are staring each other down, and it goes from like a long shot to a medium shot to the close-ups that are shifting between the two of them, which is mirrored in the final scene of the movie. In this, between the cuts, there is a slight hiccup in terms of the audience knowing where the characters are in relation to the spaces around them. And I think that it's very subtle, but that just slight little shift is what keeps us on our toes, is what keeps everything feeling so unexpected. But Sergio Leone is constantly keeping things off balance for you in movies. From the very opening shot of the movie, having that person enter from the side of the frame, and it's like an extreme close-up. It's always keeping you on your toes, surprising you in terms of the composition and the perspectives. But for me, it's the ability to really marinate in the tension of those silences that help us to really expand on that loneliness internally within the characters, within all these rangers, these bounty hunters that are sort of having an existential crisis. It's in the world building, it's in the distance between the character, the distrust that you feel between the characters, that is all adding to the feeling of not belonging and forcing yourself to kind of become a survivor as your defense mechanism. I think what's really crucial in terms of being able to embody all of that is the fact that the film takes place on American soil, and it takes place in the midst of the Civil War. But it's seen, of course, through the perspective of an Italian filmmaker who is giving us that much needed outside perspective, because often, in the heat of battle especially, a lot of passions and things like that get really toxic and very distorted. Rather than being emotionally tied to one side or the other, it's a bird's eye view, which allows us to see the complexity of both sides. We see everything from Eastwood's eyes, from Tuco's eyes, because they are outsiders as well, who feel very distant in terms of not belonging to one side or the other. And because of that, they can feel the sympathy for individual soldiers who are built by their environment and doing what they need to do because of duty. The idea of just individualism, that's the word that kept popping up in my mind as I was watching the film this last time, was the word individual. This is a movie about individualism, less about collectives. And the music, oh my God, the music is some of the best music I've ever heard for a film, ever. Rest in peace, Ennio Morricone. I put his collaborations with Sergio Leone right up there with the collaborations of like Rhoda and Fellini, Herman and Hitchcock, because he understands fundamentally what Leone is doing. He understands the humor in everything, and he also is bringing all that out through the influence of like these really kind of romantic, grandiose, epic themes that you'd hear in a lot of more traditional American films with a more traditional orchestral score. But he's weaving in all these very unique textures and this very different sort of instrumentation that gives it kind of a twang, a personality. I don't have enough good things to say about Morricone and what he was able to achieve in his career, not just in this film, but in the majority of the films that he did. He was able to give shades to melody where it was really complex, and he wasn't just giving you the emotions on a silver platter. The soundtrack for this one, you know, with its humor and, you know, just poking fun at the Western style of filmmaking and of scoring, like the Aaron Coplands and the Elmer Bernsteins and such. Ironically, this is what has become the quintessential soundtrack for the Western, just like, ironically, this film has become the quintessential Western. The Ecstasy of Gold is probably the most important piece of music in the film, next to, of course, the theme, the main theme. And just the way it's used in that final scene is just absolutely exhilarating. To me, it truly sums up, you know, the characters and the ideas of the film in just the most crackling finale. But it's funny to me, you know, like, people talk about that final moment or that final few minutes as being some of the greatest in all of cinema history. And I would agree, but I think a lot of people like to talk about, you know, like the tension and all of that. But to me, I think the best part of it is how funny it is. You know, like, there's everybody staring each other down, again, mirroring the opening of the film, where it starts out in the long shot of all three of them, and then into the medium shot, into the close-ups of their eyes, and, like, the, you know, the quick cuts between the eyes and the hands, trying to figure out who's going to shoot first. And that scene to me is hilarious because of the way that he is stretching that tension, just stretching it and stretching it and stretching it to the point where it's like, after like a few minutes, you can almost hear him kind of giggling. He's very aware of what he's doing. He's challenging the audience and challenging the idea of film as, you know, like, what is film in terms of the manipulation as a manipulative device, and just making fun of filmmaking and our general obsession with a lot of suspense sequences where it's all about the moments of anticipation and there isn't that much going on in between. I know it's such a cliche to say, but this really is one of my favorite Westerns of all time. Maybe like top 3, top 2. I feel that it completely encapsulates everything that Western should be. It is a middle finger to movies like Magnificent Seven, which came out a few years prior, which is a movie I really enjoy. I do. But it is certainly a product of Hollywood, and it's far more simplistic and lacking in maturity compared to something as sweeping and as epic, as conflicting, as self-conscious as this masterpiece. Leone he took something he was passionate about and became influenced by it, inspired by it in the best ways, and he was able to improve upon the thing that he was passionate about. Finding new perspectives, to me, that's some of my favorite things I get to see in filmmaking. And this particular perspective, I think, is almost as perfect as you can get.